we're gonna do the review. It's gonna be really short. If you want to get it, I'm also recording it. I'll get it to you tonight.
Okay, that would be fantastic. Yeah, I unfortunately have very limited bandwidth here in Vermont, and I'm glad that it worked as well as it did tonight. So, yeah, I'll look forward to it. And you would also send me the paper for the review, or the document for the review of the presentation. I'm assuming you're not recording all of the presentations, so.
Yeah, there was a couple that were missed, but I'll take that into account when I look at yours.
Okay, are you gonna be uploading those as well? Because I haven't seen those yet.
It's a possibility. I uploaded them. It's a possibility I didn't hit publish.
Okay.
So I'll take a look.
Yeah, once I see them, I have the next few days where I can work on those and get those done. They're due Friday, I believe, correct?
Yeah, just get them in before the final. So.
Okay, and do you have the day of the final yet?
The day of the final is the 13th, and we can set up a time and I'll send it to you. You're not the only one taking it remote, so.
Okay.
Whatever day between here and the 13th that works best for you.
Okay, perfect. Very good. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate this, and I hope you all have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I think I made the final much easier than the midterm. There are only 2 questions that require a calculator and could be done in just longhand within a few minutes. So no big exponential numbers. So it's gonna be, I think it'll be a lot easier. And there are several multiple choice ones, including one of the calculator ones. Tell me what problem does flow control solve?
What is what?
Huh? Yeah, when we talk about flow control and network, it solves a rate mismatch, but on what end?
Receiving end?
Well, the receiving and the sending end, right? But they're the endpoints, right? So it solves the endpoint problems, as opposed to congestion control, which does what?
Solves the middle, the routers.
It solves the routers things, right? So when we talk about flow control, what we're talking about is the queues on the endpoints, whether it's the sender or receiver. Usually, they're both sending and receiving, right? It's those queues that we're matching speeds to. Right, and when we talk about congestion control, it's everything in between. So it's the routers, it's the network that we're matching the speeds to. And speaking of routing, for district, what's the difference between link state and distance vector?
Distance vector based on hops, link state based on state status.
Yep, so those are the 2 main differences, but there are consequences for choosing each of them. What was the consequence?
So link state converges quickly, but it's not scalable.
And it's not scalable, why?
Because it has to redo the whole thing every time a node disappears, right?
Yeah, it takes an entire network picture, right? And distance vector does what?
It's the opposite, where it's great in numbers because it just converges eventually. Right.
But how does it do that? Why is it great in numbers? Because it converges eventually.
It doesn't need the whole picture of the network all at once, all on.
In fact, it only has a picture of what? It only has a
neighbors.
picture of its neighbors.
Yeah.
Right? And so distance vector allows very large networks because you only need a picture of your neighbors. But it converges slowly because particularly when things are lost in the network, then the changes to the neighbors propagate across the network very slowly. Right? Because one router has to notice that its neighbor is out, and then it has to that router has to tell its neighbors that it's out, and so on and so forth. And particularly with losses in the network where there's no signal. When you add something to the network, it's easy. You can say, hey, I'm here, right? When you lose something in the network, there's no signal for that to happen. Why is the bandwidth delay product important?
Helps determine frame size.
Helps determine frame size, and why do we need a frame size based on bandwidth delay?
You fill the network.
It's for collision avoidance.
It's text collisions. or
To avoid
text-
congestion.
The window size.
So it does all of these things, but why?
See, we didn't lose packets.
Well, so the deal is if we make a packet that fills the entire network from one end to the other, then something on the opposing end of the network, as far away as it can be, would hear a transmission prior to sending one, right? There could never be an overlap. So imagine it as you have a lane going across from one endpoint to the other, right? If your frame is the entire length of the lane, there's no possibility that somebody on the other end would send a frame back down that same lane because the packets are too small and they're not cars, right? They're trains, right? And so you make it the length of a train, I guess is the easiest way to explain it. And that way, if you make the frame the length of the train, then by the time the sender quits sending the packet, it knows that either the packet is heard, and if it uses twice that time, it can tell if there's a collision. Otherwise, you have right, if you're sending packets out that aren't the width of the network, then this one can be traveling down here sometime, and then this one sends at the same time, and they both exist on the wire at the same time.
So collision avoidance.
Yeah. So if you take that same concept, right, we use this concept at the data link layer, and we use this concept at the transmission layer. Why do we use it at the transmission layer?
So avoid collision from end to end instead of like you just like by one link. It's just for the entire thing.
So but it's not packet size is what we're talking about now, right? Right? What is at the transmission layer where we have this giant network, right? That's variable in size. At the data link layer, our networks are defined by standards, right? They can only be X number of meters apart because that's our frame size. In the internet, where we have multiple networks, right, you obviously can't have a standard that says we're only going to be this wide, right? There are, we're sending things up to space and it's coming back down, and so the networks are widely variable, but we still use the same idea in transmission protocol, right? The transmission protocol is, okay, we have a cloud, right, multiple networks in here, right? We still use this round trip idea for what? For timeouts. Timeouts, right? So what happens if you had a timeout that was too small, that was less than the round trip time? Right, you would just resend and resend and resend and resend the same packet over and over again.
So you use it at the transmission layer, so it doesn't stop so it stops resending.
Well, so you use at the transmission layer. We use this idea of a round trip time. So we talked about bandwidth delay product at the data link layer for defining network size, but this was because we were defining a standard. This is what our frame sizes would be. But really, what it is it's just a round trip time, right? our frames are round trip times, which is an actual size for it to propagate across the network on wires at 2/3 the speed of light, right, to get across. In transmission, we do the same thing, that round trip time, and this time is to manage things that don't arrive at the end of the network when they're supposed to, right? There's some fudging in there because we're no longer dealing with a single network and predictable switching speeds and so on and so forth, right? But that round trip time is solidly important for the same reasons, right? We need to be able to efficiently transmit across the network. So what are the layers of the OSI model?
7 layers.
Start at the bottom. Physical, what does physical do?
Wires.
It's wires, or
What is it?
antennas,
Fiber, yeah.
or something,
Air.
right?
Physical media.
And what does it actually do?
Shovels bits.
It shuffles bits, right? Data link layer, what's it do?
Like air.
Send in frames.
Yeah, so
Managing
it
frames.
does some framing, it does error correction. Right, physical is not capable of doing error correction, right? There has to be some logic that is built into that. And the network layer?
Managing packets.
It manages packets, and packets do what? Addressing, routing, right?
Mhm.
It also maintains point-to-point connections, right? The transport layer?
Specifying the process or the service. What type of service that's the, you know.
Manages flows now, right? And it manages congestion. It's basically a reliable end-to-end data transfer, right? And the session. These are the ones we don't think about because they're not really in anything. They're kind of blended into other things. So what's the session do?
It creates a connection. It creates a connection between the two.
It manages connections. Right? That is built into TCP already. Right?
Yes.
Even though TCP is a transport protocol, TCP also manages connections. And what about the presentation?
Just a translation, I would say.
So I
If
would
we have
just write
difference
this
in-
down because the presentation of the one is obscure. It provides data independence.
Doesn't translate from the ASCII to the other schemes.
Possibly, right? It maintains, so data coming in from one connection is not bled over
supported
into
by-
other connections,
yeah.
right, is data independence.
Okay.
And the application level is application, right? What is the difference between the OSI and the internet model? How many layers does the internet model have?
5.
That's 5. And which ones are missing out of the OSI?
Presentation.
The
and session.
confusing ones. Exactly,
Yeah.
right? So when you answer this question, you're like, I don't know what that does. We never talked about those things. Oh, those are the confusing ones. Right, they're not in there.
So the presentation and session.
The presentation and session are not in there. And the network is sometimes just called IP, right?
So physical data transport.
So, yeah, physical data, network, transport, session, presentation, and application. But you could just write down an OSI model and know what each of those do. Oh, I'm pretty sure you guys are really, really done with sockets at this point. So what is CSMA?
What is what?
CSMA.
Carrier carrier sends multiple access.
Yep, and what is CSMA-CD?
Collision detection,
It's collision detection. And CA?
collision avoidance,
What's the difference between collision detection and collision avoidance?
cycle prevention detection. Basically.
Yeah. So why collision detection is implemented everywhere it can be, always. Why are there places that it can't be implemented?
Wireless,
Wireless, why?
because you can't send and receive at the same time.
You can't send and receive at the same time, and why not?
You can't hear the reception over your
Correct,
voice.
right? So it's the law of squares, right? So when a radio antenna is speaking, transmitting, it is literally like 1,000,000 times louder than what it can hear. So in here, we're all very close, and when we talk, right, we can talk at regular, normal voice levels, right? For imagine, and when we talk, by the way, we're actually talking focused, right? Bodies are built to talk at people, our ears are meant to point at people, right? Is in wireless networks, with omnidirectional antennas, right, we just shout in every different direction, right? And that decibel level decreases exponentially as it gets further away. And so if you were on the other side of campus listening to me talk, you may, if you were concentrating, right, or you had a big like parabolic antenna, be able to hear me, but you certainly wouldn't be able to hear me while you were talking. Right, because you would drown out everything else, and the same thing applies. So what do we do in a wireless network? How do we manage the collision avoidance? Because we're bound to talk at the same time, right? And we won't hear that somebody else is talking.
You have to send something, you throw it when they're on the ground, you notify them.
So we do, we notify, first thing we do is we notify everybody that we're talking, right? Now, it's very possible that somebody else talks at the same time we do our notifications. So how do we fix that?
We can use the timing protocol, just giving everybody like a slotting time, and they start at that time. So it's basically that you have a specific time to start. So if you have packet to send, you have to wait for that slot to send your packet.
Correct, you can slot it. How do we do it in Wi-Fi? Where we have these very dynamic networks. We do what?
By using channels.
We do use channels, but still people can talk.
The access points send out a periodic signal.
So what we do is we ask to talk, right? And then we get an acknowledgement to talk. If we didn't hear an acknowledgement, then somebody asked to talk at the same time. Right? So remember I gave you the example of like a police radio, right? And like 1 AM 61, right? And then dispatch comes back with 1 AM 61, go ahead. Right? That means that they got my signal, and now they're acknowledging that the signal is mine, or the channel is mine, and I can talk. Right? So what happens if I go 1 AM 61 or Wi-Fi says, hey, I want to talk, and they get no acknowledgement back that you can talk? We wait a random amount of time. What if I do it again? So I say, hey, so I waited my random amount of time, and I say 1 AM 61, get no acknowledgement again. What do I do now?
Wait again.
Longer random
A
amount.
longer amount of time, and specifically, we double it, right? And that protocol is called what? Exponential backoff.
Back off?
Exponential backoff.
BACKOFF.
Like BACK, yep, off, back off. We are backing away and waiting a longer time, but it's still random, right? But the window that we're waiting in is wider. So we pick a random spot in a wider window. And if we don't get it again, we double the window
Double
and we
the
pick a
window.
random spot in that window. And it gets the window gets very large very quick, right?
Sorry, real quick, could you just do the acronyms again, the CSMA, CSMAD?
It's CSMA/CA, so collision avoidance, and CSMA/CD, and that's collision detection. And what is the trick with wireless, or with wired? Why can we do collision detection in wired?
Because the packets are always the length of the wire.
Yeah, so yeah, there's that. The packets is always the width, right? It's extremely focused, right? We're not broadcasting out. And what else can we do?
You can tell if someone's talking at the same time you're talking.
Power level.
Yes, you can tell. And why? How can you tell? There's tricks, right? Right? So when we say we're sending something to a wire, what we're really doing is usually manipulating a voltage, right? If somebody else manipulates the voltage at the same time, right, now we got double the voltage that we should have. And so there's other tricks that we can do on a wire that can't be done in the air. How does public key cryptosystem work? In a very simple manner.
You have a key pair, you encrypt something with one, you can't decrypt it without the other one.
Yep. So asymmetric encryption, right? What's the difference between symmetric and asymmetric encryption?
Symmetric using one key, asymmetric using two keys.
Correct. So symmetric encryption uses the same key to both encrypt and decrypt. Asymmetric encryption uses a key to encrypt and a different, entirely different, but weirdly related key to decrypt. Right? The encryption key cannot be used to decrypt. It doesn't work. So then in that scenario, you can do weird things. Right? That means that you can have a public key. And that public key can be used to encrypt things. And then, so if Steve has a public key, and that means that anybody in this room can send stuff to Steve with his public key, and only he can decrypt it. Right? We can send that across the network. Huh? Math is weird, right? So, yeah. What is public key encryption usually used for? Signing emails, certificates, right? Usually when we say a certificate, what we really mean is a public key.
Exchanging the keys.
Huh?
Exchanging the keys. No.
Yes. We use it all the time to get keys to do symmetric encryption. Why, if this is so neat, why do we use it?
Takes a
It
long
takes
time.
forever, thousands of times longer, right, to do public key. In fact, it's so slow that when we're doing emails, when you're going to sign an email, do we actually shove the whole email into the
Hash it.
PKI system? No, what do we
Hash
do?
it first.
We hash it, and then we encrypt the hash. Why do we do that? Because the hash is small. Hashes are a known algorithm, so anybody can take a SHA-1 of an email, right? So we receive an email, we take a SHA-1, and then we take, the sender encrypts with their private key, and we decrypt that hash with the public key and say, hey, did I get the same hash?
Please say a command.
All right. So if we have a limited number of bandwidth across a link, and we don't implement anything other than the native queuing for the inside of the link. So we have this bottleneck in our network, right? And we have flows going in, flows coming out, right? And we only use the native queues inside of there, so we have no queuing algorithm at all, right? And this thing is capable of handling one, whatever we're gonna call it, right? What do each of these lines get?
1/3.
1/3. Why?
Just whatever the bandwidth divided by the number of links.
Yeah, it's the bandwidth divided by the number of links, right? If this was a what if we change this to 10 and this is 2, this is 3, and this is 5? Does it change anything?
Still native queuing?
Yeah, native queuing. No, so, right, we get 1/3 of 2, right? So this link gets 1, then we get this, this one gets 2/3. This one gets 1, and this one gets 5/3, right?
I'm sorry, I missed something. The 2, the 3, and the 5, what do those represent? Like, what are those quantities?
So those are the links coming in.
Like the number of links, speed?
No, the speed, like the bandwidth of the links
Oh,
coming in.
this is the speed.
So this thing is capable of 10, and I have a 2, 3, and 5 coming in.
Okay, that makes sense then.
Right, and that means at 10, right, because this adds up to 10, that means queues are gonna start filling up. Right? Because there is some delay across the network, right? It will get 1/3. It gets divided in thirds.
The 2, 3, and 5 represents what?
Huh?
The 2, 3, and 5 represents what? Is it speed?
They're just sending rates.
Oh, sending rates.
Yeah, sending rates. We're if we had a single queue in that thing, what would the queue look like?
First come, first serve.
It would be first come, first serve, right? Right? So if it has a single queue, no algorithm again, right? That means that one link is putting a whole lot less packets in than the other links. Right? There's one queue. So if we, what was it? I had 2, 3, and 5, right?
Yes.
So if they were all sending in, that means that the queue would look something like, right, this one gets a packet. Oh, it's gonna be odd, so I'm gonna just put 2 packets in. We'll just call this 2. And then, and they wouldn't be in this order, right? The queue is also unfairly distributed, right? Which is why we're dividing out the rates unevenly. Now, they wouldn't necessarily be in that order, but it gives you the right proportions. Right? The 5s have half of the network, the 3s have 30% of the network, right? And the 2s have 20%. Now, what would happen if you gave them separate queues? queue for each flow, or each sending line, whatever. A queue for each flow. What would those flows look like?
It's longer time because
Huh?
there's space in between.
Yeah, so there'd be some weird things that would start happening, right? So let's do 2, 3, and 5 again, and let's make our choke. Let's make it really actually choke, right? So we have this thing has some it's no longer barely choked. It's just outright choked, right? There's going to be some restriction. What's the queue for 2 look like?
What do you mean, queue depth?
Yeah, what's the queue depth?
So that's 3. And has.
So remember we have 1/3, right? So the queue depth for 2 is nothing. Because we're evenly distributing the bandwidth, right? 2 will make it through, right?
No, without having to queue.
Without having a queue. 3 will be
1.
iffy-ish, right? So it won't be on the, it's a bad numbers. Those numbers won't be on the test, right? 3 happens to be the actual bandwidth, which is always like, So if the bandwidth equals, so the bandwidth here, right, we have 3 flows, there's 9, so the bandwidth is 3 megabits per second for each line. That means 3 is coming in at 3 megabits per second, or 3 units, so it doesn't matter, right? That means that it's at capacity, but there is some switching delay and things in there. So it will have a queue. Really hard to tell what it will be. It depends on this lot of factors that are really hard to measure.
Can we just do like one example of how we get the calculation of that? Just for the-
So the queue would have a minimum depth of 1,
Mhm.
right? Because it is transmitting at bandwidth, right? But it's a little tricky on the other stuff.
So if it's 4, it's going.
It could be full, like, I mean, so if it's full, then we're gonna start losing packets, right? It won't be very many packets. Now, what does 5 look like?
Queue.
5 has a full queue, right? And how many packets are being lost?
3 packets.
2 out of every 5.
40%.
40% are being lost.
So if it's 4, it's gonna be 1 that's losing for every 4 packets. That's just
Yeah,
it's
so
4.
the 2 is not losing any because it's not utilizing all this bandwidth. 3 is kind of a tricky question. And the answer there, if you ever get that, which might be the last question in here, is what if they're equal? It's just, it's hard to tell, right? It's a little tricky. It's really easy to tell if it's over, and it's really easy to tell if it's under, but if it's exactly right,
It's tricky.
yeah. the state of the queue is questionable.
Oh, sorry, what type of queuing is this called again?
So these are just independent queuing, right?
Independent
You said the state of queue was what, sir?
Huh?
That would make the state of the queue what?
Questionable, hard to tell.
Because that all depends on the logic and what it uses in application.
Correct, right? And rarely is a data stream going to be exactly 3. Are the packets evenly spaced apart? Because if they're evenly spaced apart, that makes a difference. If they're not evenly spaced apart, the queue is going to be full. If they are evenly spaced apart, the queue is not going to be full, right? There's a lot of things in there. Why does that matter? Why does the packets being evenly spaced apart matter?
Processing of it on
remember in queuing, we take we accept each individual packet independently, right? There is no, and then we measure at that state, right? And then we take the next packet and we measure at that state, and we take the next packet and measure at that state. If the packets aren't evenly on 3, if the packets aren't evenly spaced, then at one point, the bandwidth, even for a tiny little bit of time, is more at that very specific point in time, more than 3. Right? And then sometime it will be a little bit less than 3, right? Because the packets are not evenly spaced. Well, if they're more than 3, then the queue starts filling up. How long is it at more than 3? Right? These are just points in the question. Is like, it's really hard to answer, because you really need to know, how big is the queue? How long are they evenly spaced? If they're not evenly spaced, how scrunched up are they? And you got numbers for that, because all that matters.
It's like traffic on the freeway between 6 and 7 a.m.
Exactly.
After 7 a.m.
Yeah, yes, like,
Predictably full.
What were the?
there's a certain point where the traffic can be really congested, but all the cars are moving right at the right speed, right? Nobody's tapped their brakes yet or whatever, and there's no congestion. The moment somebody puts an irregularity in that network, right, you get
accordion.
slinky, right? And then it starts slinking, and it takes actually.
A long time.
Oh, well, why does it take a long time to fix?
Because there's cars still, you have to like
Because humans are terrible.
empty the queue.
But, so, if you had a computer that did this, humans are terrible, right? But if you had a computer that did this, the same thing would happen. Why?
They're like coming in at the right rate. The queue is like always, like as soon as it like empties, it fills again. So
Yes.
it's always full.
Yeah, you're essentially squishing up a queue, right? Which makes everybody have to slow down, right? And then that queue propagates backwards through the traffic, right? And then somebody else taps the brake again, right? And that queue propagates through the traffic. And so what it takes to fix is nobody tapping their brakes anymore, which is unlikely, right? Or
And everybody's slowing down behind.
the bandwidth to go well below congestion levels. If your bandwidth goes well below congestion levels, then you can tap the brake and you don't have.
Car behind you. always.
Well, you might have a car behind you and a car behind him, but it's not so close that you create a compression wave that moves backwards through the network.
They have time to react.
But even with a computer that could react almost instantaneously, once that compression happens, you have to back off. This is the reason why we have back off in TCP and everything else, right? It's hard to maintain a network at 100% or anywhere near it, because once it happens, disaster happens really, really quickly, and it's very hard to fix. That's why in TCP we cut traffic by half, right? How are weights done? So what we just talked about up there was fair queuing, right? With essentially 3 virtual queues is fair queuing. If we were going to do weighted fair queuing, how is that done?
Have a modifier on queue associated with its priority.
Yeah, we have a modifier. Right? We lie about a person's allotted bandwidth. And it changes the queue size. So remember with a FIFO queue, right, it's basically first come, first serve. So if you encounter a device, right, and it's a FIFO queue and there's 2 lines or in it, then you each get half, right? If there's 3 lines in it, you each get a third, right? So then the question becomes so I have 2 streams coming into this one, right? They each get a half, right? And then those streams come in here, but I have another stream coming in here. What happens now? So
Can you
let's,
repeat that?
huh?
Can you repeat it again?
So I had 2 coming into here,
Mhm.
I get a half, right? Each of them gets a half. And then all these devices are equal measure, right? So they all have the same thing.
Mhm.
So now I have a half coming in on this side. And I have 1 coming in here. What do each of them look like now?
Like top
The
gets
corridor?
like a half and the other gets a fourth.
Huh?
Quarters,
The top gets like a half and the other gets a fourth.
The top gets a half, right? Or actually, the top gets a third, right? Because there's 3 lines coming in,
yeah,
right?
1/4 for the other.
And they get a sixth. A half or a third.
They get a half of a third, right? No, because that doesn't add up to 1. It's gotta add up to 1.
Is it like a half
It'd be
and a fourth
limited,
and a fourth?
it'd be, the 1/2 would be restricted down to 1/3, wouldn't it? On each of those lines?
They should all be 1/3.
Yeah, they should all be 1/3. But this is first in, first out, queuing. Yeah, it was still. And then what if we went to, what if we actually implemented fair queuing? Fair queuing ensures that everything is always equal, right? So even if you come in smaller, you don't get an over allocated proportion. So I think actually it is this gets a half and this gets a fourth. Just think of the queues coming in, right? It's filling up the queues. This one is filling it up really, really fast, and these are filling it up at half as fast.
So that's fair queuing, right?
No, this is first in, first out.
Oh, sorry.
Fair queuing would ensure 1/3 all the way around.
Okay.
So
This one's fair queue?
think about the queues. So go back to the first question, right? These come in at a half, right? This is really simple, right? Because they just get half. They come out at a half, right?
Yep.
Now, it's first in, first out queuing. Think of what the queue looks like, right? This one's coming in at 1, right? So that means that this one is filling it up the queue at rate 1. These are filling up the queue at rate 1/2, right? So the queue looks like this: 1, 1, and we'll call this 1/2 A, 1/2 B, right? So this one gets 1/2, and this one gets 1/4.
That's the first in, first out.
First in, first out. Now fair queuing would say, hey, I don't want anybody to be able to over provision, right? So this one comes in at a half, this one comes in at a half, this one comes in at 1. That means that we get rid of all those and it's 1/3 each. Right? So then you get 1/3 that comes out of this thing. And then, or even better, let's give a different scenario, 1/3 comes out. And you have another one come in here. Right, with fair queuing, you get 1/3 again, right? If we went back to first in, first out, right, now these would be coming out at 1/4, right? We have another one coming out at 1, so it would be a half. Actually, no, it would be 3/4 and 2/8. Because this one is, if back to fair queuing, or first in, first out queuing, FIFO queuing. Right, this was 1/4, 1/4.
Yeah.
This one is 1/2. What if the 1/2 came out of here?
Then 1/4.
Then these are 1/4, right? This one is 1. What does our queue look like?
1, 1, 1, 1, A, B.
1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, A, B, right?
So it's 3/4.
Because this one is now coming in at 4 times the rate of the other lines, right? So it gets really, really bad. But fair queuing would just,
That's first in, first out.
this is first in, first out.
This is 6 ones. We have
Yeah, 6
Yes,
1, 1,
6
1, 1,
ones.
6
A,
ones, then AB.
because the top is coming in 4 times faster.
So the top is coming in 4 times faster,
Yes,
right?
mhm.
So we have,
It's 4 times faster than A, and 4 times faster.
it's 4 times faster than A, 4 times faster than B.
There should be 8 lines there.
It should be 8, right?
So for every A, there should be 4 ones, right?
Yes.
And then for
And for every B, there should
Yeah.
be 4 lines.
yeah. Yeah.
So then that makes those 1/10.
Yeah.
1/10, 1/10, 4.
So this is probably not a test question.
It is a test question, but this example is much harder.
Okay.
Is there any dropping involved? Because I guess, because when the queue fills up, because that,
So the queue does fill up and it does drop, right? But remember that 1 is filling the queue up much faster than either of the quarters,
okay.
right? So it is filling up at rate 1. The others are filling up at rate 1/4, right? So the when the queue fills up, when packets start falling out, what does the queue look like? What's the proportions of the queue? And that answers what the proportions of the line is. Oh, if you have to guess the value, because this is probably something we didn't cover. You have to guess a value between 1 and 10. How many guesses on average do you have to get till you get it right?
Half.
You have to get half, right? So 5. 1 and 10 is 5, right? If you had 2 to the 64th, how many guesses do you have to get on average before you get it right?
2 to the 63.
2 to 63rd. Right. And then you can figure out everything else after that. That one will be really easy, and it's like worth 9 points.
What was the first part of that?
The first part is just
Guess at number
if somebody asks on average how many times do you have to guess, right? For instance, if you had a 32-bit number, on average, how many guesses do you have to get it right? 2 to the 31.
1 to the 31.
And then you find out how easy it is to actually spoof an email if somebody doesn't implement their numbers correctly. All right, that's it.
I forgot to print out the report to go with my project. It's in the digital package that I uploaded. Okay, so you don't need a printout. Okay, cool.
So, there are big questions. Do we need to go through? Excuse me? Possibly, this question, do we need to go through?
No. You had to do stop and wait. but
Oh, you want the,
No, I mean, to prepare, just study for the final. Do we need to go back for the,
So you
oh, the file's way easier. There's,
so we stick with the,
maybe you should.
I went almost over here.
You want that.
I expect the finals grades to be really good.
Should I,
Huh? Oh, yeah.